Now let's turn to the situation in France, because to Paris, where people have been gathering outside town halls across the country to call for calm after almost a week of rioting. Crowds gathered in solidarity with one of the mayors of a Paris suburb whose wife and children were forced to flee after a burning vehicle was sent towards their house on Saturday night. It was relatively calmer on the streets of France last night, with around 150 arrests compared with more than 700 the night before. But pressure on the government continues. Well, let's go live now to our correspondent Tom Simons. And Tom, you're there in terms of today's rather more peaceful protest. Just describe what's been happening in the last half an hour or so.
Well, Matthew, we've walked through the streets of this town, Les Roses, and we've walked with the mayor of the town, Vincent Jeanbrun, surrounded by thousands of people from this town and from around the area. And they are here because it was his home, which was attacked 2 nights ago by somebody, not clear who, with a car who drove into his house. The mayor was not at home. He was at the town hall in the centre of town, but his wife and children were there, and his wife was injured in that attack. And that attack seems to have been a turning point in the events of the last week here in France. We've seen plenty of protests at night, during the darkness, smashed up cars, burnt cars, attacks on buildings, attacks on the police, attacks on the media. But it has changed. The mood has changed in the last day with events like this. Several thousand people listening to the speeches of the mayor, who's just told them that we are millions, the silent majority, and that we say stop, it's enough.
Tom, we're just watching the live pictures of that event over your shoulder. But in terms of a more general question aimed at the government and Emmanuel Macron, is there any sort of indication that the basic grievances of those protesters being policed in a different way in France, 2 types of policing, is there any indication that they are going to address that fundamental issue?
Well, look, Matthew, this is a very difficult situation for any government, any country to deal with. Far more difficult in some ways than the protests against the pension changes that Emmanuel Macron was the subject of in the last year or so. Because we're talking about deep-seated fractures in French society. There are people who've been protesting at night who are extremely angry about the way minorities are treated in this country and the way they are policed. But there are people here with signs saying, we support the forces of law and order, with guns and handcuffs on their signs. How do you reconcile those 2 sides? Well, Emmanuel Macron's been trying to tread a fine line between those 2 different positions. He's gone from arguing for bans on sales of fireworks at night to try to stop what's happening, to telling the parents of these young rioters, many of them young, that they should really try to keep their children inside. There have been attempts to bring in curfews to stop young people going out at night. But not much beyond that. There is a policy at the centre of this protest, which is a police, if you like, police mode of operation, which allows the police to open fire on fleeing suspects and vehicles if they need to be stopped. It's a controversial policy. Mr. Macron is facing a lot of calls from some of the protesters and some of their supporters to try to get that policy at least scrapped. But it's a very difficult situation.
Tom Simons, thanks very much for the latest there. Thank you.